Between the spring of 1315 and the bitter winter of 1322, the predictable weather patterns over northern Europe did not just shift, they fundamentally shattered. It began with an incessant, unnatural downpour in the spring of 1315, a relentless, freezing deluge that simply did not stop for months. The sun practically vanished behind a permanent, suffocating curtain of heavy gray clouds, marking the abrupt and catastrophic onset of a climatic anomaly that modern climatologists now refer to as the Little Ice Age. Across the Kingdom of England, the great medieval agricultural engine, which had successfully and reliably fed a booming continental population for 3 centuries, ground to a terrifying, muddy halt. What you are looking at right now is not a primitive failure of early farming, but a highly sophisticated, intricately balanced biological system pushed completely past the absolute limits of biology and physics. This is County Kent in the year 1317. It is the second consecutive year of complete, devastating crop failure. The open field system below you, divided into meticulously measured and negotiated strips, was engineered to sustain over 200 people in this specific village. Under normal climatic conditions, a single medieval villain family working a standard 20-acre holding could generate upwards of 14,000 calories a day, enough to feed themselves, pay the mandatory church tithe, and owe grueling physical labor to the manorial lord. But wheat, the foundation of their entire caloric economy, cannot grow underwater. The winter seeds drowned in the dark furrows before they could ever sprout. The spring crops rotted at the root before they could ripen into food. And as the grain failed, the livestock died in staggering, unprecedented numbers. A highly contagious, devastating disease known as the murrain swept through the flooded pastures, wiping out up to 70% of the sheep and cattle across the entire realm. Without the immense muscular power of oxen to pull the heavy iron-tipped moldboard plows through the dense clay, the fields could not be turned for the next planting season. It was a compounding, inescapable civilizational catastrophe. In the span of just 12 agonizing months, the price of wheat skyrocketed by an unimaginable 800%. To survive the harshest and most lethal famine in European history, these peasant farmers had to employ extraordinary collective intelligence and brutal, heartbreaking triage. They shifted their entire caloric reliance to the hardier crops that miraculously survived the mud: peas, beans, and deep-root vegetables. When those reserves finally ran out, they turned to the unthinkable. They bled their remaining draft animals just enough to drink the hot blood without killing the beast. They gathered fallen acorns, wild weeds, and aggressively scraped the rough bark from oak and elm trees, grinding the tough wood fiber to mix with their absolute last grains of flour just to create the desperate illusion of bread. Every single calorie was mathematically calculated with life-or-death precision. The village reeve guarded the communal stone granary with his life, making the impossible, haunting decision to deny starving children extra rations in order to fiercely protect the seed corn for the following year. Because these people intimately knew the most terrifying agricultural truth of the medieval world. If you eat next year's seeds today, the entire village guarantees its own extinction tomorrow. An estimated 10 to 25% of northern Europe's population perished during the Great Famine. Entire settlements vanished into the freezing mud, leaving nothing but ghost outlines in the earth. But this specific village fought back. Not through magic, not through charity from the elite, but through an incredibly resilient, distributed risk system, and a desperate, unyielding endurance that modern society has long forgotten. To truly comprehend how these medieval farmers survived such an apocalypse, you must first understand the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of their daily biology. During a normal agricultural year, the daily rhythm of a medieval peasant was dictated purely by the sun and the soil. But during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, time was measured entirely by the frantic expenditure and desperate conservation of calories. A heavy agricultural laborer working the dense clay soils of the English Midlands required between 2,500 and 3,000 calories a day just to maintain their basic body weight. They fueled this massive human engine primarily with complex carbohydrates, dense, heavy loaves of dark rye and barley bread, and massive quantities of pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew of oats, legumes, and root vegetables. But when the torrential rains drowned the wheat, the caloric math collapsed entirely. A typical day during the famine began hours before dawn, often at 4 in the morning inside pitch-black, freezing wattle-and daub cottages. With the fields completely waterlogged, the traditional plowing schedule was completely abandoned. Instead, the village mobilized every able-bodied person to fight the water itself. For 14 to 16 agonizing hours a day, these peasants stood waist-deep in freezing mud, using wooden spades reinforced with thin strips of iron to hand-dig massive drainage trenches. They were attempting to artificially alter the topography of the land to save the spring planting. It was an astonishing feat of unrecorded engineering, executed entirely by starving people operating on the absolute brink of biological collapse. The physical toll on the human body was catastrophic. Skeletal remains extracted from 14th-century agricultural cemeteries reveal a horrifying truth about this specific labor. Over 60% of adult male skeletons show severe spinal compression fractures from carrying incredibly heavy loads of wet mud and waterlogged oak timber. We see stark lines of arrested growth in their teeth, permanent physical scars left behind by periods of acute, agonizing starvation during their childhoods. The average height for a male agricultural laborer dropped to around 5 feet 5 inches, measurably shorter than the Roman populations that lived on that same land before them, serving as a direct biological indicator of severe, generational nutritional stress. Their diet during the disaster was reduced to a terrifying minimum. The morning meal was often just hot water boiled with a few bitter scavenged greens. Midday rations in the field, if there were any available at all, consisted of a tiny fragment of hard, stale bark bread, meant only to keep the workers from collapsing face-first into the freezing trenches. By evening, a family of 5 would share a single clay pot of watery broth containing a few stunted turnips or buried root vegetables that somehow survived the floods. They were operating on perhaps 800 calories a day, performing heavy manual labor that required over 3,000. Yet, beneath this unyielding misery lay a profound, calculated discipline. Medieval sleep patterns were often biphasic, meaning they slept in 2 distinct phases, waking in the middle of the night to tend the fire or check on the remaining livestock. In the famine years, this waking hour was a time of grim, terrified assessment. They knew exactly how much physical energy they could afford to spend the next day. They knew that a single day of missed labor could mean the collapse of a drainage wall, which would wipe out the remaining spring crop, effectively signing a death warrant for the entire family by winter. It was a life lived on the absolute razor's edge of human endurance, driven by a fierce, communal intelligence. The medieval agricultural system was not merely a method of growing food from the earth. It was a highly sophisticated, deeply entrenched machine of political, legal, and economic extraction. At the very center of this oppressive machine was the manorial lord, the absolute owner of the land, and the church, the absolute owner of the soul. During a year of bountiful harvest, this systemic feudal taxation was oppressive but biologically manageable. But during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, when the relentless rains drowned the fields and the caloric margin dropped to absolute zero, this bureaucratic machine transformed into an engine of mass starvation. The architecture of this control was terrifyingly complete. Consider the practice known as week work. Even as their own children starved in dark, freezing cottages, villain peasants were legally required to abandon their own dying crops 2 or 3 days a week to perform grueling manual labor on the Lord's domain, the private, often better-drained fields reserved exclusively for the manor's profit. If a peasant refused or was simply too weak from starvation to work, they faced devastating, ruinous fines in the manorial court, meticulously recorded on parchment rolls by the Lord's educated steward. These surviving court records provide modern historians with the most agonizingly detailed ledger of human despair ever written. Then came the inescapable church tithe. No matter how catastrophic the flooding became, no matter how many cattle perished in the rotting pastures, the church demanded exactly 10% of the gross harvest before a single grain could be eaten by the farmer who actually grew it. This was not a polite suggestion. It was brutally enforced by the threat of eternal damnation and immediate physical ruin. When the harvest failed entirely, the bailiffs still arrived with their heavy wooden carts, ruthlessly extracting the remaining survival reserves of peas and beans, legally exporting life-saving calories out of dying villages to fill the massive, dry stone tithe barns situated high on the Lord's Hill. The feudal monopoly extended even to the physical mechanics of grinding grain. Manorial lords owned the massive water mills and strictly mandated that all peasants grind their wheat there, taking a heavy percentage of the flour as a mandatory payment. Owning a simple stone hand quern in your own home was a severe, highly punishable crime. When the famine hit and the massive river mills ran completely empty, desperate mothers caught grinding scavenged acorns or tree bark with hidden stones in the dead of night were heavily fined or violently evicted into the freezing rain. When a peasant finally succumbed to the physical ravages of starvation, the extraction still did not end. Under the brutal manorial law of Harriet, or the death tax, the lord was legally entitled to confiscate the grieving family's best remaining animal, a final devastating economic blow to the surviving widow and children. This was the dark, unvarnished reality of the feudal contract. The system was meticulously designed to ensure that the risk of agricultural failure was borne entirely by the poorest workers freezing in the mud, while the surplus was hoarded securely behind the dry, impenetrable stone walls of the manor house. Yet, incredibly hidden deep beneath the earth floors of their rotting wattle and daub cottages, the peasants continuously fought back. They secretly buried tiny sealed clay pots of stolen seed grain, an extraordinary, silent, and highly illegal resistance that kept just enough calories safely hidden in the ground to ensure that when the rains finally stopped, humanity could begin to plant again. When the flooded crops completely failed and the precise caloric mathematics of the village totally collapsed, the human body itself became the final tragic battlefield of the Great Famine. The physical reality of surviving on the absolute extreme margins of biological viability is horrifyingly clear in the archaeological record. The bread these desperate peasants consumed was a terrifying, gritty mixture of ground elm bark, dried peas, and scavenged field weeds, violently milled in hidden stone querns. Because medieval millstones naturally shed tiny fragments of rock into the flour, and desperate peasants intentionally added literal dirt and heavy bark to artificially increase the volume of their meals, the extreme friction wore human teeth entirely down to the raw gum line by the age of 30. Every single bite of this grim survival food was an exercise in acute, piercing dental agony. But starvation was only the beginning of their torment. The water they drank was the silent, devastating killer. As the torrential rains continued relentlessly through the dark months of 1317, the deep surface mud, toxic agricultural runoff, and the rotting, putrid carcasses of livestock slaughtered by the murrain disease washed heavily into the shallow communal village wells. The water turned biologically lethal. Without dry firewood available to boil it safely, the freezing peasants were forced to drink contaminated, muddy runoff, triggering massive village-wide outbreaks of severe dysentery and deadly waterborne fevers. The village herbalist, relying entirely on generations of accumulated botanical intelligence, fought back bravely with natural compounds like white willow bark, but against the sheer, overwhelming scale of the environmental contamination, mortality rates skyrocketed uncontrollably. An estimated 10 to 25% of the entire northern European population was wiped out in just a few agonizing years. For those who somehow survived the disease, the grueling physical labor itself threatened to permanently destroy them. The physical environment had turned incredibly hostile and physically dangerous. Attempting to hand-dig massive drainage trenches through heavy, saturated clay while operating on barely 800 calories a day pushed the human musculoskeletal system far past its breaking point. A single slip in the deep, freezing mud, a dropped waterlogged oak timber, or a completely crushed leg from a falling bank of heavy earth was a catastrophic economic event. In the medieval village, there were absolutely no social safety nets. If the primary laborer of a household suffered a shattered bone and could no longer walk behind a heavy iron plow, that entire family was essentially marked for starvation by the time the following winter arrived. Death was omnipresent, completely stripped of all modern romanticism. There was absolutely no dry wood to spare for constructing coffins. The dead were simply wrapped tightly in rough linen shrouds and lowered directly into freezing, waterlogged graves dug frantically in the pouring rain. The psychological trauma inflicted on the remaining survivors was absolute, completely shattering the minds of mothers and fathers who had to bury their own children in the flooded mud. Yet, against all modern logic and expectation, this resilient community did not entirely collapse. Driven by an incredible tactile intelligence regarding slope, drainage, and soil mechanics, these starving people managed to engineer a massive network of trenches entirely by hand, physically diverting the deadly floodwaters away from the remaining arable land. When the water finally receded and they touched the dark, exposed clay, they proved their brilliance. History often conveniently sanitizes the grim reality of agricultural failure, but the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was a period of unimaginable, unvarnished horror that tested the absolute limits of human sanity. When the crops drowned and the cattle died of the murrain, the deeply entrenched social contract of the feudal system completely disintegrated. The medieval village was not a peaceful, romantic commune. It was a ruthless economic engine operating on razor-thin caloric margins. When those margins vanished entirely, the descent into desperate primal survival was immediate, violent, and utterly terrifying. As the debt mounted and the lord's bailiffs aggressively demanded their cash rents despite the catastrophic floods, the poorest peasants faced impossible, nightmarish choices. Archival evidence from surviving manorial court rolls shows a horrifying, unprecedented spike in land surrenders and forced evictions. Starving families, pushed to the absolute psychological brink, were legally forced to sell off their remaining iron tools, their heavy winter clothing, and tragically, the physical labor of their own children into permanent manorial servitude just to buy a few handfuls of rotting, imported grain. The muddy roads of England and France quickly filled with wretched, endless lines of starving migrants, peasants evicted from entirely collapsed manors, wandering the drowned, freezing landscape in a futile, desperate search for food. This mass migration sparked violent, deadly riots outside the fortified stone granaries of the few surviving villages. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the medieval famine, charity was a literal death sentence. Village reeves and desperate local farmers fought viciously to protect their meager reserves, brutally beating starving refugees to death in the freezing mud rather than sharing the precious calories strictly required to keep their own families alive. In the dead of night, the profound psychological terror of starvation pushed some completely over the edge. The ultimate agricultural taboo was violently broken. Desperate individuals dug up their hidden, stolen reserves and consumed the raw, unprocessed seed corn. To eat the seed corn is to commit deliberate biological suicide, sacrificing the entire future of the harvest for just one more day of life. Yet, across the frozen, ruined open fields, others employed incredible, primal survival intelligence. They violently smashed through the thick winter ice with heavy iron hooks, plunging their bare, frostbitten arms into the freezing black sludge to extract massive, deep-rooted weeds like burdock, boiling the bitter, filthy roots to extract the absolute last remaining starches hidden in the frozen soil. Meanwhile, entirely insulated behind the massive, impenetrable limestone walls of their elevated manor houses, the feudal lords feasted in warmth. The aggressive hoarding of wealth allowed the nobility to import extremely expensive grain from unaffected regions, completely insulating themselves from the horror unfolding in the muddy valleys below. The famine was fundamentally an entirely unequal disaster, engineered by a deeply flawed system that ensured the risk was borne entirely by the starving workers, while the surplus was protected by heavily armed guards. Yet, despite the overflowing mass graves, despite the bloody riots, and despite the agonizing deaths of those who stubbornly stood guard in the freezing snow, the core of the medieval agricultural machine miraculously held. Through a ruthless, terrifying collective discipline, a fraction of the population managed to successfully protect the sealed clay pots of seed corn. When the relentless rains finally broke in the spring of 1318, the skeletal survivors walked back out into the thawing mud, ready to plant the seeds that would save Europe. The ultimate legacy of the medieval agricultural system is not found in grand marble statues or famous, illuminated historical texts. It is written permanently and directly into the earth itself. If you fly a high-resolution drone over the modern English Midlands today, you will clearly see millions of acres of lush, green pasture that undulate in massive, rhythmic, unnatural waves. These are the physical, permanent scars of the ancient ridge and furrow open field system. They are the exact, incredibly precise trenches dug by those starving peasants 700 years ago, perfectly preserved beneath the modern grass, vastly outlasting the imposing stone castles of the lords who ruthlessly oppressed them. The people who engineered this massive system were historically categorized as ignorant, uneducated, primitive serfs. This is perhaps the greatest and most arrogant lie in the history of agriculture. Operating entirely without maps, without GPS technology, and without any formal scientific understanding of soil chemistry, these illiterate farmers organized a continent-wide hyper-complex food production machine. Their highly successful three-field crop rotation system, where nitrogen-fixing legumes were meticulously and strategically balanced against demanding, nutrient-draining crops like winter wheat, was an astonishing empirical discovery. They intuitively mastered the complex thermodynamics of water-meadow irrigation and the intricate physics of soil drainage, engineering a system so incredibly resilient that modern organic polyculture is largely just a technological rediscovery of their ancient medieval methods. The sheer volume of data they successfully managed without computers is equally staggering. In modern, highly sterile archives in London, You can unroll the massive parchment manorial court rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries. These documents contain the most agonizingly detailed, data-rich ledger of human existence ever written. The exact, specific yield of every single strip of land, the crushing debts of every starving family, the exact date a specific peasant froze to death in the mud, it was all meticulously recorded in permanent iron gall ink by the Lord's educated stewards. This bureaucratic extraction was unbelievably ruthless, but it inadvertently preserved the names, the struggles, and the mathematical reality of the very people the system was meticulously designed to exploit. Today we casually walk into beautifully lit modern bakeries and purchase flawless, perfectly safe artisan bread without a single second thought. We are completely and totally insulated from the absolute biological terror of the harvest. But the sheer, staggering abundance of the modern world exists solely because of the agonizing trial and error endured by the medieval peasantry. When the Great Famine of 1315 struck with apocalyptic force, and the rains drowned the vital crops for years on end, human civilization was pushed to the absolute brink of total collapse. It was only the fierce, unyielding discipline of the medieval village, their profound willingness to endure unimaginable physical suffering to protect the seed corn, their desperate re-engineering of the flooded landscape entirely by hand, that prevented total mass extinction in northern Europe. They did not survive by magic, and they were certainly not saved by the charity of the feudal elite. They survived because they possessed a profound tactile intelligence regarding the earth, and an unbreakable collective human will to endure the storm. The next time you break a piece of warm bread, remember the frozen, muddy fields of 1317. Remember the people who ate tree bark. They are the true architects of our modern world.